So, first thing I'd like to say is you should have a handout about this course, and there's a course schedule there, and also I've got a list of the main sources that I've used. And on the back page of that list of main sources, you'll see a little heading, a note from Neil. So read that, and I'd be very appreciative if you acted on it, because the Tasmanian Constitution Society is trying to improve governance in this state, and there's a great need for it. As we all saw in yesterday's paper about the right to information laws and how ineffectual they are, and how there's a culture of secrecy in this state. The more members we have, the more we can do. There's strength in numbers. So that's the end of the ad. First, let's get back to what we're talking about today, the man who made Trump. So when Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in 2016, the world was shocked. No one expected it. And if you can believe Trump's niece, he didn't expect it either. He had defied the opinion polls. He had defied conventional political wisdom. He defied how most people thought a potential president should behave. And he continues to defy in the most egregious ways. We shake our heads in disbelief that such an unqualified, unsuitable, unstable person was elected to the most powerful position in the Western world. We ask ourselves, how could this happen? And it could happen again. There's a debate on today, I think it's tomorrow morning our time, the first of the presidential debates. Well, like most political phenomena, the causes for Trump's victory were multiple and they weren't instantaneous. The foundation of Trump's support base were laid half a century before he was elected. Now we'll explore those causes, especially one that had more influence than any other, Ronald Reagan. Now let's have some audience participation. When I say Ronald Reagan, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Anyone? Actor? Yeah. Nancy. Yeah, you're pretty on the money. Yeah, yes, Dr. Bowl. Alzheimer's. B grade, Alzheimer's, and what was your contribution? Dithering. Right. No, it's not terribly complimentary. So all of those things are quite right, and we will be exploring them in detail in the coming weeks. But Reagan's legacy, and no one mentioned this, is the effect of economic and social policies that fueled and propelled the deep divide that's in the United States today. Let's call that divide the Great Schism that was adroitly exploited by Trump. Today, we're going to talk about social cohesion and the three elements that are the glue that holds society together. Then we'll turn our attention to legitimacy and how it's undermines social cohesion. And then we'll have a look at Ronald Reagan's contribution to that undermining of social cohesion, that encouragement of division, and how Trump widened it. And then we'll examine the influence Reagan had on Trump voters. Now, the United States is the most divided it has been since the Civil War. Most commentators and historians agree. Now, I'm not saying that Ronald Reagan created the Great Schism, which Trump exploits, but I am saying he was a major contributing factor. He didn't encourage social cohesion, he deepened divisions that were already present. Now, division is part of the history of the United States. It's part of the country's DNA. For instance, the War of Independence that began in 1776 The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, when President George Washington sent troops to Pennsylvania to quell an uprising by citizens who refused to pay a liquor tax. The Civil War from 1861 to 1865, and the civil rights demonstrations of the 1960s. Division and violence is more the rule rather than the exception. Author, historian and journalist Dr. Nick Bryant's latest book, The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself, argues that the United States has always been divided and that Trump's 2016 win was the culmination of political, sociological, economic, technological and cultural shifts that went back decades. His presidency had almost become historically inescapable. Now, every political leader has a choice, and that choice is to unite or divide. I will argue Ronald Reagan chose division. His economic and social policies and dog whistling to racists deepened divisions, and those divisions created a generation of people who were disillusioned, disenchanted and disengaged. And when the former New York real estate developer turned television reality show host declares the American dream is dead, I am your warrior, and violence in the streets is Democrats' fault, his supporters all agree. His words are consistent with their reality. The American dream is dead for them. Now, here at last was someone who understands them, who will be their champion, because until now, no one has. Now, there are many factors that contributed to the making of a cohort of right-wing, nationalist, anti-democracy supporters. But Ronald Reagan's policies were a major influence. The opposite to division, of course, is harmony. In a society, it's social cohesion. A society's social cohesion is determined by the three ways disagreement is managed. First, the ballot box. We might not have voted for the winner, but we accept the result. And between elections, there's a judicial process to settle disputes, and we accept the results of those proceedings. A US the courts, the judicial system. Questions about breaches of criminal and civil law are settled by courts. And we accept their decisions, even if those decisions don't go our way, because we accept the judicial system is fair and legitimate. Third, the administrative system. People accept government authorities' decisions, such as police and public servants, even if the decision is not in their favour. These decisions are accepted because people believe the administrative system is fair and legitimate. They believe the system of justice is fair and legitimate. They believe the voting system is fair and legitimate. And that brings us to one of the first people to write about legitimacy in a political sense. And for those of you that have been to other presentations I've done, you'll be familiar with the Germans, one of the founders of sociology, Max Weber. He wrote that legitimacy comes from authority, and he said there were three types of authority. First, traditional authority, which is the one that developing societies have, where power is vested in the leader of a tribe. The leader inherits his position, and authority comes from tradition, which it always has and always will. Charismatic leadership. The leader's authority comes from real or perceived extraordinary qualities that draws people to him or her. Remember that. That's a key point when we're talking about Ronald Reagan. Legal, rational. Laws are created by a rational process that are administered and enforced by servants of the state. So you're with me so far. So, Weber said that charisma was a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue which he is set apart from ordinary men and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. Reagan was charismatic, and so is Trump. Exceptional communication skills is what sets them apart. And it's not just what they say, it's how they say it. But it's more than that. The singer, activist and scholar, Maya Angelou, puts it well, people won't remember what you said or did, but they will remember how you made them feel. Reagan used clear and concise language that was easy to understand. He used stories to get his point across, and those points were delivered in his reassuring, professional actor's voice. Not only was he convincing, but he was optimistic, and he made other people feel optimistic. He made them feel good about themselves. He made them feel good about the present and the future. Trump doesn't make people feel optimistic, and his language is crude, rude, and at times offensive. But it is always clear, concise, and easy to understand. He was so different to other media-trained politicians who spoke in platitudes and tried to avoid answering journalists' questions. We're all familiar with that. And to disillusioned, detached, and despondent white working-class voters, particularly men, Trump's style was a breath of fresh air. He tells it like it is. Those voters think he talks like them. He is just like them. More importantly, he makes them feel listened to. They know he might not have all the answers and he might not be able to fix all the problems, but they feel he is on their side. Weber's other authority type of interest to us is legal rational, a system of laws created by a legislature and approved by the head of state. If someone breaks the law, there is a process to settle disagreements. And the governed accept the results because they have confidence in the political and administrative system. It is legitimate. For that legitimacy to be maintained, though, citizens must have confidence in electoral, judicial and other institutions. If doubt is cast on those institutions, society is weakened. Reagan cast doubt from the start of his political career that began long before he ran for public office. His criticism was constant of government's inefficiencies, injustice and unfairness, all of which implied the government was not on the side of the ordinary citizen, people like you and me. Now we need to draw a distinction here. I'm not saying for a minute that people should not be critical of the government. The Tasmanian Constitution Society certainly is, and of other political parties. So it's important to make that distinction. We're not talking about criticism of the government. We're talking about words that undermine the process, that undermine the legitimacy of government. So Trump has done more than anyone to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the US government and its institutions. Long before his refusal to accept the 2020 election result and the insurrection, Trump cast doubt on the electoral system. During the 2016 campaign, he said, On November 8, the arrogance of Washington DC will come face to face with the righteous verdict of the American voter. Here, the government is pitted against the people. In other words, the government is opposed to the people. And so, by the way, is the media. Not all media, though, but the producers of fake news. Organisations, institutions like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and many more. Any media that he thought opposed him were fake news and should be ignored. The government, the fake media and elites are not on his side and therefore not on your side either. Now, we've got an idea about what we mean by legitimacy. Let's have a look at the wedges Reagan used to deepen and widen the Great Schism that helped create the Trump voter. First, his anti-government rhetoric and policies. Second, there were tax cuts for the wealthy, huge tax cuts. Government programs were cut, so the people that needed help no longer got it. There was the deregulation of business. There were constant anti-elites rhetoric, and there was adroit exploitation of voters' fears. So let's have a look at each of these. First, anti-government. During the 1964 election campaign, Reagan made a speech that was televised to the nation, paid for by his rich backers. And let's just hear what he has to say. This, by the way, was in support of the Republican Party 1964 presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater.
This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves.
Now, note the words. A little intellectual elite in a far distant capital. The elite is apart from us. It's little. We're not. We're the majority. It's intellectual. So therefore it's made up of out-of-touch, arrogant types who have no idea about what life is like for us. And it's in a far distant capital, thousands of kilometres away from us, geographically and metaphorically. 52 years later, Trump made much of this little intellectual elite. He told voters he'd clean out the elites in that far distant capital. He would drain the swamp. The Washington swamp. Drain the swamp's literal meaning is to get rid of malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And as we all know, malaria can be fatal. So its metaphoric meaning is to exterminate something harmful. The implication is the people working in government in Washington were as dangerous as mosquitoes carrying the potentially fatal disease of malaria. That is what he's saying. The first use, though, of drain of the swamp wasn't by who you might think, but someone you may not have heard of. This is Winfield E. Gaylord. He was a left-wing political organiser. In 1903, he said, socialists are not satisfied with killing a few of the mosquitoes which might come from the capitalist swamp. They want to drain the swamp. Reagan announced in the first few months of his presidency, he had come to Washington to drain the swamp by appointing a commission of inquiry into the operation of government. But it seems 35 years later, the swamp still needed draining. Trump was just the person to do it. He declared often that he would drain the swamp, and his method of draining was to ban executive branch officials and former members of Congress from lobbying for 5 years after they leave office or government service. To expand the definition of lobbyists, to ban senior executive branch officials for life from lobbying on behalf of a foreign government, and to stop registered foreign lobbyists from raising money in American elections and politics. Now that all sounds fair enough really, doesn't it? But the problem isn't with the proposals, but the language of drain the swamp. The implication was people who work for the government in Washington were not working for the people, not working for ordinary people, not working for people like you and I. I am your voice is another Trump catch cry. He is saying, I understand you, unlike those swamp dwellers in Washington who have power over you. The second factor that deepened the divide between the haves and have-nots was cutting taxes. The US tax system before 1980, the year that Ronald Reagan was elected, top income earners were meant to pay 70 cents of tax in the dollar. When I say meant to, I haven't been able to find the percentage of top bracket income earners who actually paid that amount. Reagan advocated tax cuts throughout his political career. The theory was tax cuts would put more money in private hands, that would create more investment, and that would create more productivity and more jobs. Everyone would win, even the poor. An economic tide of prosperity would rise and everyone would ride the wave. According to the Congressional Budget Office in 1982, a family's income that was less than $10,000 got no tax cut. In fact, it was the opposite. They paid $140 a year more in tax. But a family's income of more than $80,000 gained $8,320. The Americans best positioned to ride the wave were those who were wealthy, who owned companies, bought stocks and shares, or were left large inheritances. They were helped by successive presidents, including Trump. He cut the individual income tax rate by 25% across the board and corporate tax from 35% to 21%. Now let's turn our attention to the third factor that Reagan implemented that sent voters to Trump: cuts to government programs. In 1981 and 1982, Reagan cut more than $22 billion from social welfare programs. Federal student loans were cut. That deprived potential tertiary students from getting a degree. A modest program that paid businesses to train and hire economically disadvantaged people was cut. The Congressional Budget Office estimated non-working poor families lost about 10% of their federal benefits from the cuts in the first Reagan budget. It was worse for working families who had some income, but they lost between 30% and 40%. In some instances, people were forced back on welfare, the opposite to what the cuts intended. Women suffered disproportionately because they were disproportionately represented at the bottom of the economic ladder. There was a large population of single women who supported a family and a household with no other wage earner. When food stamps were cut by $1.5 billion over 3 years, it hit women the hardest because 69% of families on food stamps were headed by women. A medical benefit program for the over 65s, Medicaid, was cut by $1 billion. 61% of Medicaid recipients were poor women. Reagan demonised people dependent on government income. In the 1980 New Hampshire primary campaign, he made welfare part of his stump speech. So let's hear what he said. And this was the beginning of this bashing of people who were dependent on government benefits, something that still exists today.
In Chicago, they found a woman who holds the record. She used 80 names, 30 addresses, 15 telephone numbers to collect food stamps, Social Security, veterans benefits for 4 non-existent deceased veterans' husbands, as well as welfare. Her tax-free cash income alone has been running $150,000 a year.
Well, you can hear the crowd's murmur of shock and disapproval. And we can imagine what they thought, can't we? Our hard-earned taxes are supporting fraudsters, and God knows how many more of them there are. But like many of Reagan's stories, this wasn't quite true. Authorities could not verify the amount the woman was supposed to have earned. So she was tracked down, they found who it was, but it worked well for Reagan because he won every one of New Hampshire's 10 counties in that primary election. But his demonisation of people dependent on government was far-reaching. And also it was racist because African Americans and people of colour were more dependent on government than white people. A book published in 2015 by Catherine Eden and Luke Schaefer argued Reagan started legitimisation of attacks on people who are dependent on welfare. We'll come back to this when we examine Reagan's legacy in later weeks.
In Chicago.
The fourth factor that contributed to the deepening and widening of the Great Schism is the deregulation of business. American Prospect editor Harold Mayerson wrote in 2008 that Reagan's deregulations policies caused Wall Street to embark on an orgy of speculative investment and debt accumulation. In October 1982, Reagan signed a bill into law that lifted many restrictions on the savings and loans industry. It enabled lenders to provide larger real estate loans and to compete with money market funds. It encouraged high-risk commercial real estate ventures, many tarnished by corruption. In 1996, a forerunner of the global financial crisis in 2008, the savings and loans industry was bailed out by taxpayers at a cost of $160 billion. Now we come to Reagan's anti-elite rhetoric. First, let's be clear about what we mean by elites. And Stuart, do you want to open the door? Because I can see some people who might like to come in. So first, let's be clear about what we mean by elites. The sociological meaning is a group of people who exert power and influence in a specific aspect of social, political and economic life that's disproportionate to their number. Elites are in religious organisations, corporations and political parties. So in other words, elites are people that we need. We need elites for society to function. Now let's have a look at what our friend Max Weber has to say about power, which is what elites are often accused of abusing. He defined power as being the ability of an individual or group to achieve their own goals or aims when others are trying to prevent them from realising them. Elites are a natural occurrence in any organisation. Not everyone can be a decision maker. That's why private and public organisations have boards and executive management teams. Elites are the people who run things. We have to have them for society to function. Reagan and Trump weaponised and demonised the word by turning it into a term of abuse. Remember the little intellectual elite in a far distant capital from Reagan's 1964 speech. Trump told us there was a Washington elite, people high up in government, a traditional media elite that we've talked about, the people that produced the fake news, and people who were tertiary educated. So he was saying elites are people who have power over us, ordinary people. They're not like us, they don't understand us, and they certainly don't act in our interests. On the contrary, they act in their interests. So the elites are our enemy. The sixth contribution Reagan made to the great schism that helped create Trump was playing on fears. Now, there's been plenty of threats to the existence of the United States itself. Plenty to fear. Fear is part of the USA's DNA. First, the Civil War, which threatened to split the country. The Great Depression, there was the Cold War, and race riots. And it could all happen again. The Great Schism has two parts, economic and social. The economic division is shown in the enormous difference in people's earning power. First, let's have a look at a graph that shows the huge and widening gap between rich and poor in the United States. This graph shows the incomes of the top 1% of earners increased by 267% from 1979 to 2019. So we can see here how income earners have gone up rather rapidly, and then we can see here how middle and lower income earners have done, not nearly as well. So for the lowest income earners, the increase was 89%. So 267% for top income earners, 89% for average income earners. The average salary in 1973 was $4,500. In 2023, it's at $62,800. But look at the average CEO salary. 1.1 million in 1973, 15 million in 2023. So remember, these figures are averages. One CEO near the top of the pile is this man, Michael Rapino of Live Nation Entertainment. He earned $139 million in 2022. The median wage for his company's employees was $25,673. Leading a large organisation in today's complex world is a lot more challenging than what it was 50 years ago. But it doesn't justify salaries of hundreds of millions of dollars. Reagan's deregulation and tax cut policies are a major cause of this. They created this. The Great Schism is also evident in the social sphere. As the economic divide has been widening, the social divide has too. Vanderbilt University measures fluctuations in America's faith and trust in its political institutions. It is based on several factors, including extreme ideological positions, disapproval of the president, and protest. It has provided an annual report based on these measures for the past 46 years. It won't surprise you, the lowest scores were when Trump was in office between 2017 and 2021. And that 2017 to 21 period is the Vanderbilt University's latest report, which it describes that period as consumed with divisive political rhetoric and critique of democratic institutions. High points that didn't last were Obama's first year and Reagan's first year. And you can see there that it lasted reasonably well in Reagan's period of office. But you can see the gradual decline. The Pew Research Centre shows that in 1964, a remarkable 77% of Americans said they trusted the federal government to do what's right just about always or most of the time. 1964 was the year that Ronald Reagan made his speech, the nationally televised speech that we saw a moment ago. But then came a precipitous decline that you can see there that began with the Vietnam War and was helped along by Watergate. And by 1979, only 27% of Americans trusted their government. Trust picked up a bit under Reagan, and it fluctuated under Bill Clinton and has steadily dropped since then, never rising above 20%. So that means that only 20% of Americans trust the federal government to do what's right just about always or most of the time. Although trust in government did go up during Reagan's term, his constant carping about the evils of government, his deregulation of the economy that unleashed rampant, uncontrolled capitalism, and cuts to government agencies and services contributed to the long-term decline in trust. And Trump has exploited that by engaging the dispossessed, disenchanted and disengaged who were created by these economic changes that Reagan implemented. Now, there were numerous reasons why people voted for Trump. The main ones, I think, were support to criminalise abortion, the Christian religion to be dominant, and revitalising the American dream. Back in 1980, abortion was starting to be a deciding issue for voters. Many voters backed Reagan because he was anti-abortion, and they voted for him just because of that. The religious right was starting to become influential, and certainly enough for its leaders to tell its followers to vote for Reagan. And the third factor, revitalising the American dream, Reagan promised to make America great again. His election as the 40th president in November 1980 changed the United States and the world. Reagan spelled out his ideology in his inaugural address on the 20th of January 1981.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Bear with me.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else? All of us together, in and out of government, must bear the burden. The solutions we seek must be equitable, with no one group singled out to pay a higher price. Must bear the burden. The solutions we seek must be equitable, with no one group singled out to pay a higher price.
Now, let's have a look at those words a little closer. Now, you probably know Reagan is known for saying government is the problem. Government had become an elite group that was not government for, by and of the people. Today's radical right-wingers have used Reagan's words to promote their extreme agenda. His words can be taken out of context to mean government is a problem and doesn't represent the people. Finally, remember the last words of that clip: the solutions we seek must be equitable, with no group singled out to pay a higher price, and we would all agree with that, would we not? Well, he singled out groups, they paid a higher price, and they are still paying for it. We are all still paying for it. They are the homeless, the working poor, the unemployed, and the diminishing middle class. The disadvantaged, the people deprived of tertiary education because of government cuts, gay people and others who had AIDS, because the Reagan administration, unlike Australia's government, treated the illness as a moral problem and not a health crisis. Now I've explained how the Great Schism happened and what it created, let's have a look at the 2016 election. The popular vote. Hillary Clinton won 65,853,514 votes. Trump, 62,984,828 votes. 2.8 million more people voted for Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. The most qualified and the most suitable candidate lost to the most unqualified and unsuitable candidate because he won the Electoral College. Now let's have a look about how that happened. The United States founders feared government power. When they were creating the Constitution, they just fought a war against the British and its monarchical system of government. The founders thought the monarch was a dictator, and although they created the role of president, they were determined the holder of the office could not become a dictator. They wanted as many checks and balances on the role as possible. The Electoral College was one of those checks. You see, the people could get it wrong, so the Electoral College could override them. Electoral College delegates are current or former political party officials, state legislators and party activists. They are selected either at party conventions or by party central committees. This map shows the number of Electoral College votes of each state. After the election, the college meets and delegates cast their vote for the candidate that won the most votes in their state. The number of Electoral College votes is decided by population. California has 55 Electoral College votes, New York 29, Texas 38. But the system has a gerrymander. Wyoming has a population of 577,000, not much more than Tasmania's. The state has 3 Electoral College votes. California, at the other end of the population scale, has a population of 40 million, and it has 55 Electoral College votes. Now, it makes sense. The state with the biggest population has a seemingly larger number of delegates, doesn't it? But one Wyoming delegate represents 192,000 people. One Californian delegate represents 727,000 people. Wyoming's delegates have 4 times the voting power than California's. Now, a Gallup poll found 61% of Americans support abolishing the Electoral College in favour of the popular vote. However, that support diverges widely based on political parties. 89% of Democrats support abolishing the Electoral College, but only 23% of Republicans do. Now let's get back to the 2016 vote. Ms. Clinton won 62% of the vote in California, as I said, and 59% in New York. Trump also won by big margins in strong Republican states, such as Texas. But he also won smaller states by smaller margins. Now, the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system. And that is how he won the presidency. Because he won those smaller states by a smaller margin, he won all the Electoral College votes in those states. And this is the danger that is very evident and could happen this coming November. Now let's have a look at who voted for whom in 2016. According to exit polls, voters with a high school diploma, for Trump, 51%, Hillary Clinton, 45%. So relatively even there. Of the 70% of voters who were white, 58% voted for Trump, 37% voted for Clinton. Of black voters, 8% for Trump, 88% for Clinton. White voters, 58% for Trump, 37% for Clinton. Rural voters, 62% for Trump, 34% for Clinton. Urban voters, 35% for Trump, 59% for Clinton. An astonishing result was that 18% of respondents who felt that Trump was not qualified to be president voted for him. And 20% of them felt he did not have the necessary temperament to be the president. 2016 exit polls showed Hillary Clinton was part of the hated political establishment, the out-of-touch Washington crowd, the swamp, who looked down on and worked against ordinary people. Trump didn't. And I think a big mistake that Hillary Clinton made was calling Trump supporters deplorable. Huge mistake. But Trump made his supporters feel important. And they weren't going to vote for someone who would do more of the same and call them deplorable, because they'd had the same over and over and over and over again, and they'd heard the promises over and over and over again. And here was Trump, who was promising something different, something better. Now, for a quick recap about what we've talked about today, we discussed social cohesion and the three elements that is the glue that holds society together. We talked about legitimacy and how it's undermining, undermines social cohesion, and we talked about Ronald Reagan's contribution to that division. I hope you come back next week. Because next week we're going to delve into Reagan's childhood, especially the powerful influence of his father. We'll have a look at his early career in radio as a sports broadcaster and his career in Hollywood, as well as his two marriages. So does anyone have any questions, queries, comments, or criticisms? Yes.
How do you explain Trump's popularity given that he's part of the money-making elite?
Well, I think people put that aside, don't worry about it. The key thing is that he's for me. So, yes, he might have money, but, you know, I know that he will be good for me and is in my interest for me to vote for him. It reminds me of a Four Corners program in, I think, the 2004 election when Bush Jr. was running for re-election. And they interviewed a farmer in Ohio. Now, George Bush, the Bush family are multi-billionaires, right? Absolutely loaded. George Bush himself was a very wealthy man. And this farmer was saying, John Kerry was the Democrat candidate for president, and this farmer was saying, well, he would vote for Bush because he was a nice guy, and He had a ranch just like this farmer. So he'd have bush over for a barbecue. But John Carey, well, he speaks a foreign language. He speaks French, and his wife's foreign. So we can't have someone like that. And I think that's the appeal of Trump as well. People think that they see his riches, but think, well, we could have that too. If we have him in office, we've got a better chance of getting that than if we had a normal candidate. Anybody else? Yes.
The British will be voting on Nigel Farage in 2 weeks.
Yes, and you heard it here first. So the question was more a comment. The British people will be voting for Nigel Farage next week. I think that he will outpoll the Conservatives, which is really dangerous because he was instrumental in Brexit. Anybody else? Yes. Ian. Hi,
To be
Dan.
honest, I'm fearful of the world at the moment. Do you think anything like Trump could happen in this country?
Well, it nearly did, Scott Morrison. And before him we had Tony Abbott. Scott Morrison had no respect for government, for the process, for democracy, and that was before he swore himself into all the ministries, even before then. So it's just, we did dodge a bullet there, but we've got to be, we have to be careful, and I think that it's important that people who stand for office show their democratic bona fides. Anybody else? Yes.
The welfare queen that you're talking about that made 150,000 tax-free, they went back and fact-checked it. In fact, she made 8,300.
Yeah. But that doesn't matter, because what matters is how we felt about it. And if you were there, if you'd heard Reagan say that, you would have felt angry, and you'd remember that anger. And where you said that was fact-checked. Well, we can't.
They went back and found
Yeah.
a woman. She was a black lady who
Yeah.
accrued under 8,500.
Yeah. So without a doubt, she's a fraud, wrong, shouldn't have done it. But there's a big difference between $8,000 and $150,000. And I think people who had heard Reagan say that, and if those facts were then put to them, they'd say it was fake news. That's where did that come? That's made up. And so I think we're in a post-truth era, which is really troubling as well, where facts don't matter. It's how you feel that matters. And if it sounds right, probably is right. Anybody else? Yes, Danny.
What was Trump's latest opinion on Julian Assange, just out of interest?
No, I don't know.
He's excellent opinions.
Yeah. The question was what's Trump's position on Julian Assange? I think that he definitely vacillated. He loved WikiLeaks at one point because it helped him, or he perceived that it helped him when he was running for office. But I'm not sure what his position is now. Okay, well look, thank you very much one and all, and I look forward to seeing you next week.